Welcome to the Nerdjacker's Codex Vault. Today we are reading Ways and Means by Greek military leader Xenophon, translated by H.G. Dakins, Part 1. For myself, I hold to the opinion that the qualities of the leading statesman in a state, whatever they be, are reproduced in the character of the constitution itself. As, however, it has been maintained by certain leading statesmen in Athens that the recognized standard of right and wrong is as high at Athens as elsewhere, but that, owing to the pressure of poverty on the masses, a certain measure of injustice in their dealing with the allied states could not be avoided. I set myself to discover whether by any manner of means it were possible for the citizens of Athens to be supported solely from the soil of Attica itself, which was obviously the most equitable solution. For if so, herein lay, as I believed, the antidote at once to their own poverty and to the feeling of suspicion with which they are regarded by the rest of Hellas. I had no sooner begun my investigation than one fact presented itself clearly to my mind, which is that the country itself is made by nature to provide the amplest resources. And with a view to establishing the truth of this initial proposition, I will describe the physical features of Attica. In the first place, the extraordinary mildness of the climate is proved by the actual products of the soil. Numerous plants which in many parts of the world appear as stunted leafless growths are here fruit-bearing. And as with the soil, so with the sea indenting our coasts, the varied productivity of which is exceptionally great. Again, with regard to those kindly fruits of earth which Providence bestows on man season by season, one and all they commence earlier and end later in this land. Nor is the supremacy of Attica shown only in those products which year after year flourish and grow old, but the land contains treasures of a more perennial kind. Within its folds lies embedded by nature an unstinted store of marble, out of which are chiseled temples and altars of rarest beauty and the glittering splendor of images sacred to the gods. This marble, moreover, is an object of desire to many foreigners, Hellenes and barbarians alike. Then there is land which, although it yields no fruit to the sower, needs only to be quarried in order to feed many times more mouths than it could as cornland. Doubtless we owe it to a divine dispensation that our land is veined with silver, if we consider how many neighboring states lie round us by land and sea, and yet into none of them does a single thinnest vein of silver penetrate. Indeed, it would be scarcely irrational to maintain that the city of Athens lies at the navel, not of Hellas merely, but of the habitable world. So true is it that the farther we remove from Athens, the greater the extreme of heat or cold to be encountered. Or to use another illustration, the traveler who desires to traverse the confines of Hellas from end to end will find that, whether he voyages by sea or by land, he is describing a circle, the center of which is Athens. Once more, this land, though not literally sea-girt, has all the advantages of an island, being accessible to every wind that blows, and can invite to its bosom or waft from its shore all products, since it is peninsular, whilst by land it is the emporium of many markets, as being a portion of the continent. Lastly, while the majority of states have barbarian neighbors, the source of many troubles, Athens has, as her next-door neighbors, civilized states which are themselves far remote from the barbarians. Part 2. All these advantages, to repeat what I have said, may, I believe, be traced primarily to the soil and position of Attica itself, but these natural blessings may be added to, in the first place, by a careful handling of our resident alien population, and for my part, I can hardly conceive of a more splendid source of revenue than lies open in this direction. Here you have a self-supporting class of residents, conferring large benefits upon the state, and instead of receiving payment themselves, contributing on the contrary to the gain of the exchequer by the sojourner's tax. Nor, under the term careful handling, do I demand more than the removal of obligations which, whilst they confer no benefit on the state, have an air of inflicting various disabilities on the resident aliens. And I would further relieve them from the obligation of serving as hoplites side by side with the citizen proper, since beside the personal risk, which is great, the trouble of quitting trades and homesteads is no trifle. Incidentally, the state itself would benefit by this exemption if the citizens were more in the habit of campaigning with one another rather than shoulder to shoulder with Lydians, Phrygians, Syrians, and barbarians from all quarters of the world, who form the staple of our resident alien class. Besides the advantage of so weeding the ranks, it would add a positive luster to our city, were it admitted that the men of Athens, her sons, have reliance on themselves rather than on foreigners to fight her battles. And further, supposing we offered our resident aliens a share in various other honorable duties, including the cavalry service, I shall be surprised if we do not increase the goodwill of the aliens themselves, whilst at the same time we add distinctly to the strength and grandeur of our city. In the next place, seeing that there are at present numerous building sites within the city walls, as yet devoid of houses, supposing the state were to make free grants of such land to foreigners for building purposes, in cases where there could be no doubt as to the respectability of the applicant, if I am not mistaken, the result of such a measure will be that a larger number of persons and of a better class will be attracted to Athens as a place of residence. Lastly, if we could bring ourselves to appoint as a new government office a board of guardians of foreign residents like the Archon, our guardians of orphans, with special privileges assigned to those guardians who should show on their books the greatest number of resident aliens. Such a measure would tend to improve the goodwill of the class in question, and in all probability, all people without a city of their own would aspire to the status of foreign residents in Athens, and so further increase the revenues of the city. Part 3. At this point, I propose to offer some remarks in proof of the attractions and advantages of Athens as a center of commercial enterprise. In the first place, it will hardly be denied that we possess the finest and safest harborage for shipping, where vessels of all sorts can come to moorings and be laid up in absolute security as far as stress of weather is concerned. But further than that, in most states the trader is under the necessity of lading his vessel with some merchandise or other in exchange for his cargo, since the current coin has no circulation beyond the frontier. But at Athens he has a choice. He can either in return for his wares export a variety of goods, such as human beings seek after, or, if he does not desire to take goods in exchange for goods, he has simply to export silver, and he cannot have a more excellent freight to export, since wherever he likes to sell it, he may look to realize a large percentage on his capital. Or again, supposing prizes were offered to the magistrates in charge of the market for equitable and speedy settlements of points in dispute, to enable anyone so wishing to proceed on his voyage without hindrance, the result would be that far more traders would trade with us and with greater satisfaction. It would indeed be a good and noble institution to pay special marks of honor, such as the privilege of the front seat, to merchants and ship owners, and on occasion to invite to hospitable entertainment those who, through something notable in the quality of ship or merchandise, may claim to have done the state a service. The recipients of these honors will rush into our arms as friends, not only under the incentive of gain, but of distinction also. Now, the greater the number of people attracted to Athens either as visitors or as residents, clearly the greater the development of imports and exports. More goods will be sent out of the country, there will be more buying and selling, with a consequent influx of money in the shape of rents to individuals and dues and customs to the state exchequer. And to secure this augmentation of the revenues, mind you, not the outlay of one single penny, nothing needed beyond one or two philanthropic measures and certain details of supervision. With regard to the other sources of revenue which I contemplate, I admit it is different. For these I recognize the necessity of a capital to begin with. I am not, however, without good hope that the citizens of this state will contribute heartily to such an object, when I reflect on the large sums subscribed by the state on various late occasions, as, for instance, when reinforcements were sent to the Arcadians under the command of Lysistratus, and again at the date of the generalship of Hegeselios. I am well aware that ships of war are frequently dispatched, and that too, although it is uncertain whether the venture will be for the better or for the worse, and the only certainty is that the contributor will not recover the sum subscribed, nor have any further share in the object for which he gave his contribution. But for a sound investment, I know of nothing comparable with the initial outlay to form this fund. Anyone whose contribution amounts to 10 minae may look forward to a return as high as he would get on bottomry of nearly 1/5 as the recipient of 3 obols a day. The contributor of 5 minae will on the same principle get more than a third, while the majority of Athenians will get more than cent per cent on their contribution. That is to say, a subscription of 1 mina will put the subscriber in possession of nearly double that sum, and that, moreover, without setting foot outside Athens, which, as far as human affairs go, is as sound and durable a security as possible. Moreover, I am of opinion that if the names of contributors were to be inscribed as benefactors for all time, many foreigners would be induced to contribute, and possibly not a few states, in their desire to obtain the right of inscription. Indeed, I anticipate that some kings, tyrants, and satraps will display a keen desire to share in such a favor. To come to the point, were such a capital once furnished, it would be a magnificent plan to build lodging houses for the benefit of shipmasters in the neighborhood of the harbors, in addition to those which exist, and again, on the same principle, suitable places of meeting for merchants, for the purposes of buying and selling, and thirdly, public lodging houses for persons visiting the city. Again, supposing dwelling houses and stores for vending goods were fitted up for retail dealers in Piraeus and the city, they would at once be an ornament to the state and a fertile source of revenue. Also, it seems to me, it would be a good thing to try and see if, on the principle on which at present the state possesses public warships, it would not be possible to secure public merchant vessels, to be let out on the security of guarantors, just like any other public property. If the plan were found feasible, this public merchant navy would be a large source of extra revenue. Part 4. I come to a new topic. I am persuaded that the establishment of the silver mines on a proper footing would be followed by a large increase in wealth apart from the other sources of revenue, and I would like, for the benefit of those who may be ignorant, to point out what the capacity of these mines really is. You will then be in a position to decide how to turn them to better account. It is clear, I presume, to every one that these mines have for a very long time been in active operation. At any rate, no one will venture to fix the date at which they first began to be worked. Now, in spite of the fact that the silver ore has been dug and carried out for so long a time, I would ask you to note that the mounds of rubbish so shoveled out are but a fractional portion of the series of hillocks containing veins of silver, and as yet unquarried. Nor is the silver-bearing region gradually becoming circumscribed. On the contrary, it is evidently extending in wider area from year to year. That is to say, during the period in which thousands of workers have been employed within the mines, no hand was ever stopped for want of work to do. Rather, at any given moment, the work to be done was more than enough for the hands employed. And so it is today with the owners of slaves working in the mines. No one dreams of reducing the number of his hands. On the contrary, the object is perpetually to acquire as many additional hands as the owner possibly can. The fact is that with few hands to dig and search, the find of treasure will be small, but with an increase in labor, the discovery of the ore itself is more than proportionally increased. So much so, that of all operations with which I am acquainted, this is the only one in which no sort of jealousy is felt at a further development of the industry. I may go a step farther. Every proprietor of a farm will be able to tell you exactly how many yoke of oxen are sufficient for the estate, and how many farm hands. To send into the field more than the exact number requisite, every farmer would consider a dead loss. But in silver mining operations, the universal complaint is the want of hands. Indeed, there is no analogy between this and other industries. With an increase in the number of bronze workers, articles of bronze may become so cheap that the bronze worker has to retire from the field. And so again with iron founders. Or, again, in a plethoric condition of the corn and wine market, these fruits of the soil will be so depreciated in value that the particular husbandries cease to be remunerative, and many a farmer will give up his tillage of the soil and betake himself to the business of a merchant or of a shopkeeper, to banking or money lending. But the converse is the case in the working of silver. There, the larger the quantity of ore discovered and the greater the amount of silver extracted, the greater the number of persons ready to engage in the operation. One more illustration. Take the case of movable property. No one, when he has got sufficient furniture for his house, dreams of making further purchases on this head, but of silver, no one ever yet possessed so much that he was forced to cry enough. On the contrary, if ever anybody does become possessed of an immoderate amount, he finds as much pleasure in digging a hole in the ground and hoarding it as in the actual employment of it. And from a wider point of view, when a state is prosperous, there is nothing which people so much desire as silver. The men want money to expend on beautiful armor and fine horses and houses and sumptuous paraphernalia of all sorts. The women betake themselves to expensive apparel and ornaments of gold. Or when states are sick, either through barrenness of corn and other fruits or through war, the demand for current coin is even more imperative, whilst the ground lies unproductive, to pay for necessaries or military aid. And if it be asserted that gold is after all just as useful as silver, without gainsaying the proposition, I may note this fact about gold, that, with a sudden influx of this metal, it is the gold itself which is depreciated whilst causing at the same time a rise in the value of silver. The above facts are, I think, conclusive. They encourage us not only to introduce as much human labor as possible into the mines, but to extend the scale of operations within by increase of plant, etc., in full assurance that there is no danger either of the ore itself being exhausted or of silver becoming depreciated. And in advancing these views, I am merely following a precedent set me by the state herself. So it seems to me, since the state permits any foreigner who desires it to undertake mining operations on a footing of equality with her own citizens. But, to make my meaning clearer on the question of maintenance, I will at this point explain in detail how the silver mines may be furnished and extended so as to render them much more useful to the state. Only I would premise that I claim no sort of admiration for anything which I am about to say, as though I had hit upon some recondite discovery. Since half of what I have to say is at the present moment still patent to the eyes of all of us, and as to what belongs to past history, if we are to believe the testimony of our fathers, things were then much of a piece with what is going on now. No, what is really marvelous is that the state, with the fact of so many private persons growing wealthy at her expense, and under her very eyes, should have failed to imitate them. It is an old story, trite enough to those of us who have cared to attend to it, how once on a time Nicias, the son of Niceratus, owned 1,000 men in the silver mines, whom he let out to Sosius, a Thracian, on the following terms. Sosius was to pay him a net obol a day, without charge or deduction, for every slave of the 1,000, and be responsible for keeping up the number perpetually at that figure. So again Hipponicus had 600 slaves let out on the same principle, which brought him in a net mina a day without charge or deduction. Then there was Philomonides, with 300, bringing him in half a mina, and others, I make no doubt there were, making profits in proportion to their respective resources and capital. But there is no need to revert to ancient history. At the present moment there are hundreds of human beings in the mines let out on the same principle. And given that my proposal were carried into effect, the only novelty in it is that, just as the individual in acquiring the ownership of a gang of slaves finds himself at once provided with a permanent source of income, so the state, in like fashion, should possess herself of a body of public slaves, to the number, say, of 3 for every Athenian citizen. As to the feasibility of our proposals, I challenge anyone whom it may concern to test the scheme point by point, and to give his verdict. With regard to the price, then, of the men themselves, it is obvious that the public treasury is in a better position to provide funds than any private individuals. What can be easier than for the council to invite by public proclamation all whom it may concern to bring their slaves, and to buy up those produced? Assuming the purchase to be effected, is it credible that people will hesitate to hire from the state rather than from the private owner, and actually on the same terms? People have at all events no hesitation at present in hiring consecrated grounds, sacred victims, houses, etc., or in purchasing the right of farming taxes from the state. To ensure the preservation of the purchased property, The Treasury can take the same securities precisely from the lessee as it does from those who purchase the right of farming its taxes. Indeed, fraudulent dealing is easier on the part of the man who has purchased such a right than of the man who hires slaves. Since it is not easy to see how the exportation of public money is to be detected when it differs in no way from private money, whereas it will take a clever thief to make off with these slaves, marked as they will be with the public stamp, and in face of a heavy penalty attached at once to the sale and exportation of them. Up to this point, then, it would appear feasible enough for the state to acquire property in men and to keep a safe watch over them. But with reference to an opposite objection, which may present itself to the mind of someone, what guarantee is there that, along with the increase in the supply of laborers, there will be a corresponding demand for their services on the part of contractors? It may be reassuring to note, first of all, that many of those who have already embarked on mining operations will be anxious to increase their staff of laborers by hiring some of these public slaves. Remember, they have a large capital at stake, and again, many of the actual laborers now engaged are growing old. And secondly, there are many others, Athenians and foreigners alike, who, though unwilling and indeed incapable of working physically in the mines, will be glad enough to earn a livelihood by their wits as superintendents. Let it be granted, however, that at first a nucleus of 1,200 slaves is formed. It is hardly too sanguine a supposition that out of the profits alone, within 5 or 6 years, this number may be increased to at least 6,000. Again, out of that number of 6,000, supposing each slave to being in an obol a day clear of all expenses, we get a revenue of 60 talents a year. And supposing 20 talents out of this sum laid out on the purchase of more slaves, there will be 40 talents left for the state to apply to any other purpose it may find advisable. By the time the round number of 10,000 is reached, the yearly income will amount to 100 talents. As a matter of fact, the state will receive much more than these figures represent, as anyone here will bear me witness who can remember what the dues derived from slaves realized before the troubles at Decelia. Testimony to the same effect is borne by the fact that in spite of the countless number of human beings employed in the silver mines within the whole period, the mines present exactly the same appearance today as they did within the recollection of our forefathers. And once more, everything that is taking place today tends to prove that, whatever the number of slaves employed, you will never have more than the works can easily absorb. The miners find no limit of depth in sinking shafts or laterally in piercing galleries. To open cuttings in new directions today is just as possible as it was in former times. In fact, no one can take on himself to say whether there is more ore in the regions already cut into, or in those where the pick has not yet struck. Well then, it may be asked, why is it that there is not the same rush to make new cuttings now as in former times? The answer is because the people concerned with the mines are poorer nowadays. The attempt to restart operations, renew plant, etc., is of recent date, and anyone who ventures to open up a new area runs a considerable risk. Supposing he hits upon a productive field, he becomes a rich man, but supposing he draws a blank, he loses the whole of his outlay. And that is a danger which people of the present time are shy of facing. It is a difficulty, but it is one on which, I believe, I can offer some practical advice. I have a plan to suggest which will reduce the risk of opening up new cuttings to a minimum. The citizens of Athens are divided, as we all know, into 10 tribes. Let the state then assign to each of these 10 tribes an equal number of slaves, and let the tribes agree to associate their fortunes and proceed to open new cuttings. What will happen? Any single tribe hitting upon a productive lode will be the means of discovering what is advantageous to all. Or supposing 2 or 3, or possibly the half of them, hit upon a lode, clearly these several operations will proportionally be more remunerative still. That the whole 10 will fail is not at all in accordance with what we should expect from the history of the past. It is possible, of course, for private persons to combine in the same way, and share their fortunes and minimize their risks. Nor need you apprehend, sirs, that a state mining company established on this principle will prove a thorn in the side of the private owner, or the private owner prove injurious to the state, but rather like allies who render each other stronger the more they combine. So in these silver mines, the greater number of companies at work, the larger the riches they will discover and disinter. This then is a statement, as far as I can make it clear, of the method by which, with the proper state organization, every Athenian may be supplied with ample maintenance at the public expense. Possibly some of you may be calculating that the capital requisite will be enormous. They may doubt if a sufficient sum will ever be subscribed to meet all the needs. All I can say is, even so, do not despond. It is not as if it were necessary that every feature of the scheme should be carried out at once, or else there is to be no advantage in it at all. On the contrary, whatever number of houses are erected, or ships are built, or slaves purchased, etc., these portions will begin to pay at once. In fact, the bit-by-bit method of proceeding will be more advantageous than a simultaneous carrying into effect of the whole plan, to this extent. If we set about erecting buildings wholesale, we shall make a more expensive and worse job of it than if we finish them off gradually. Again, if we set about bidding for hundreds of slaves at once, we shall be forced to purchase an inferior type at a higher cost. Whereas, if we proceed tentatively, as we find ourselves able, we can complete any well-devised attempt at our leisure, and in case of any obvious failure, take warning and not repeat it. Again, if everything were to be carried out at once, it is we, sirs, who must make the whole provision at our expense. Whereas, if part were proceeded with, and part stood over, the portion of revenue in hand will help to furnish what is necessary to go on with. But to come now to what everyone probably will regard as a really grave danger, lest the state may become possessed of an overlarge number of slaves, with the result that the works will be overstocked. That again is an apprehension which we may escape if we are careful not to put into the works more hands from year to year than the works themselves demand. Thus I am persuaded that the easiest method of carrying out this scheme as a whole is also the best. If, however, you are persuaded that, owing to the extraordinary property taxes to which you have been subjected during the present war, you will not be equal to any further contributions at present, what you should do is this. During the current year, resolve to carry on the financial administration of the state within the limits of a sum equivalent to that which your dues realized before the peace. That done, you are at liberty to take any surplus sum, whether directly traceable to the peace itself, or to the more courteous treatment of our resident aliens and traders, or to the growth of the imports and exports, coincident with the collecting together of larger masses of human beings, or to an augmentation of harbor and market dues. This surplus, I say, however derived, you should take and invest so as to bring in the greatest revenue. Again, if there is an apprehension on the part of any that the whole scheme will crumble into nothing on the first outbreak of war, I would only beg these alarmists to note that, under the condition of things which we propose to bring about, war will have more terrors for the attacking party than for this state. Since what possession, I should like to know, can be more serviceable for war than that of men? Think of the many ships which they will be capable of manning on public service. Think of the number who will serve on land as infantry, in the public service, and will bear hard upon the enemy. Only we must treat them with courtesy. For myself, my calculation is that even in the event of war, we shall be quite able to keep a firm hold of the silver mines. I may take it we have in the neighborhood of the mines certain fortresses, one on the southern slope in Anaphlistus, and we have another on the northern side in Thoricus, the two being about 7.5 miles apart. Suppose then a third breastwork were to be placed between these, on the highest point of Bessa, that would enable the operatives to collect into one out of all the fortresses, and at the first perception of a hostile movement, it would only be a short distance for each to retire into safety. In the event of an enemy advancing in large numbers, they might certainly make off with whatever corn or wine or cattle they found outside. But even if they did get hold of the silver ore, it would be little better to them than a heap of stones. But how is an enemy ever to march upon the mines in force? The nearest state, Megara, is distant, I take it, a good deal over 60 miles, and the next closest, Thebes, a good deal nearer 70. Supposing then an enemy to advance from some such point to attack the mines, he cannot avoid passing Athens, and presuming his force to be small, we may expect him to be annihilated by our cavalry and frontier police. I say, presuming his force to be small, since to march with anything like a large force, and thereby leave his own territory denuded of troops, would be a startling achievement. Why, the fortified city of Athens will be much closer, the states of the attacking parties, than they themselves will be by the time they have got to the mines. But, for the sake of argument, let us suppose an enemy to have arrived in the neighborhood of Laurium. How is he going to stop there without provisions? To go out in search of supplies with a detachment of his force would imply risk, both for the foraging party and for those who have to do the fighting. Whilst, if they are driven to do so in force each time, they may call themselves besiegers, but they will be practically in a state of siege themselves. But it is not the income derived from the slaves alone to which we look to help the state towards the effective maintenance of her citizens, but with the growth and concentration of a thick population in the mining district, various sources of revenue will accrue, whether from the market at Sunium, or from the various state buildings in connection with the silver mines, from furnaces and all the rest. Since we must expect a thickly populated city to spring up here, if organized in the way proposed, and plots of land will become as valuable to owners out there as they are to those who possess them in the neighborhood of the capital. If, at this point, I may assume my proposals to have been carried into effect, I think I can promise not only that our city shall be relieved from a financial strain, but that she shall make a great stride in orderliness and in tactical organization. She shall grow in martial spirit and readiness for war. I anticipate that those who are under orders to go through gymnastic training will devote themselves with a new zeal to the details of the training school, now that they will receive a larger maintenance whilst under the orders of the trainer in the torch race. So again, those on garrison duty in the various fortresses, those enrolled as peltasts, or again as frontier police to protect the rural districts, one and all will carry out their respective duties more ardently when the maintenance appropriate to these several functions is duly forthcoming. Part 5. But now, if it is evident that, in order to get the full benefit of all these sources of revenue, peace is an indispensable condition, if that is plain, I say, the question suggests itself, would it not be worthwhile to appoint a board to act as guardians of peace? Since no doubt, the election of such a magistracy would enhance the charm of this city in the eyes of the whole world, and add largely to the number of our visitors. But if anyone is disposed to take the view that by adopting a persistent peace policy, this city will be shorn of her power, that her glory will dwindle and her good name be forgotten throughout the length and breadth of Hellas, the view so taken by our friends here is in my poor judgment somewhat unreasonable. For they are surely the happy states, they, in popular language, are most fortune-favored, which endure in peace the longest season. And of all states, Athens is preeminently adapted by nature to flourish and wax strong in peace. The while she abides in peace, she cannot fail to exercise an attractive force on all. From the mariner and the merchant upwards, all seek her, flocking they come. The wealthy dealers in corn and wine and oil, the owner of many cattle, and not these only, but the man who depends upon his wits, whose skill it is to do business and make gain out of money and its employment. And here another crowd, artificers of all sorts, artists and artisans, professors of wisdom, philosophers and poets, with those who exhibit and popularize their works. And next a new train of pleasure-seekers, eager to feast on everything sacred or secular, which may captivate and charm eye and ear. Or once again, where are all those who seek to effect a rapid sale or purchase of 1,000 commodities, to find what they want, if not at Athens? But if there is no desire to gainsay these views, only that certain people, in their wish to recover that headship which was once the pride of our city, are persuaded that the accomplishment of their hopes is to be found, not in peace, but in war, I beg them to reflect on some matters of history, and to begin at the beginning, the Median War. Was it by high-handed violence, or as benefactors of the Hellenes, that we obtained the headship of the naval forces and the trusteeship of the treasury of Hellas? Again, when through the too cruel exercise of her presidency, as men thought, Athens was deprived of her empire, is it not the case that even in those days, as soon as we held aloof from injustice, we were once more reinstated by the islanders, of their own free will, as presidents of the naval force? Nay, did not the very Thebans, in return for certain benefits, grant to us Athenians to exercise leadership over them? And at another date, the Lacedaemonians suffered us Athenians to arrange the terms of hegemony at our discretion, not as driven to such submission, but in requital of kindly treatment. And today, owing to the chaos which reigns in Hellas, if I mistake not, an opportunity has fallen to this city of winning back our fellow Hellenes without pain or peril or expense of any sort. It is given to us to try and harmonize states which are at war with one another. It is given to us to reconcile the differences of rival factions within those states themselves, wherever existing. Make it but evident that we are minded to preserve the independence of the Delphic shrine in its primitive integrity, not by joining in any war, but by the moral force of embassies throughout the length and breadth of Hellas. And I for one shall not be astonished if you find our brother Hellenes of one sentiment, and eager under seal of solemn oaths to proceed against those, whoever they may be, who shall seek to step into the place vacated by the Phocians and to occupy the sacred shrine. Make it but evident that you intend to establish a general peace by land and sea, and, if I mistake not, your efforts will find a response in the hearts of all. There is no man but will pray for the salvation of Athens next to that of his own fatherland. Again, is anyone persuaded that, looking solely to riches and money-making, the state may find war more profitable than peace? If so, I cannot conceive a better method to decide that question than to allow the mind to revert to the past history of the state and to note well the sequence of events. He will discover that in times long gone by, during a period of peace, vast wealth was stored up in the Acropolis, the whole of which was lavishly expended during a subsequent period of war. He will perceive, if he examines closely, that even at the present time we are suffering from its ill effects. Countless sources of revenue have failed, or if they have still flowed in, been lavishly expended on a multiplicity of things. Whereas, now that peace is established by sea, our revenues have expanded, and the citizens of Athens have it in their power to turn these to account as they like best. But if you turn on me with the question, do you really mean that even in the event of unjust attacks upon our city on the part of any, we are still resolutely to observe peace towards that offender? I answer distinctly, no. But on the contrary, I maintain that we shall all the more promptly retaliate on such aggression in proportion as we have done no wrong to anyone ourselves, since that will be to rob the aggressor of his allies. Chapter 6. But now, if none of these proposals be impracticable, or even difficult of execution, if rather, by giving them effect, we may conciliate further the friendship of Hellas, whilst we strengthen our own administration and increase our fame, if by the same means the people shall be provided with the necessaries of life, and our rich men be relieved of expenditure on war, if with the large surplus to be counted on, we are in a position to conduct our festivals on an even grander scale than heretofore, to restore our temples, to rebuild our forts and docks, and to reinstate in their ancient privileges our priests, our senators, our magistrates, and our knights, surely it were but reasonable to enter upon this project speedily, so that we too, even in our own day, may witness the unclouded dawn of prosperity in store for our city. But if you are agreed to carry out this plan, there is one further counsel which I would urge upon you. Send to Dodona and to Delphi, I would beg you, and consult the will of heaven, whether such a provision and such a policy on our part be truly to the interest of Athens, both for the present and for the time to come. If the consent of heaven be thus obtained, we ought then, I say, to put a further question. Whose special favor among the gods shall we seek to secure with a view to the happier execution of these measures? And in accordance with that answer, let us offer a sacrifice of happy omen to the deities so named, and commence the work. Since if these transactions be so carried out with the will of God, have we not the right to prognosticate some further advance in the path of political progress for this whole state? Our audiobook ends here. Thank you for listening. If you want any particular book in this channel, please let us know in the comments.